octave of Christmas, this Sunday that falls at the end of the year, is dedicated to the contemplation of the Holy Family. And there's a temptation on the Feast of the Holy Family to turn it into something that is purely vague and sentimental. You know, that the Feast of the Holy Family is to teach us how to love each other better. And this is, of course, a figment of truth, but there's something much more profound that when we leave it at a sentimental level, we miss the depths of what is being presented before us. To comprehend it, I think first we have to look at today's gospel before looking at the myriad of other readings attached to it. What are we hearing in the gospel? Well, first of all, we can look at the devout figures of Simeon and Anna, two devout people. Simeon particularly, we're told, is awaiting the consolation of Israel. If you'll remember back just a few weeks to the second week of Advent, we heard Isaiah 40, comfort ye my people. Those words of consolation for God's people after their time of exile and punishment. Simeon is awaiting the comforting of God towards his people. And so he proclaims the promise of God fulfilled with the arrival of this child in the temple. Aha, the consolation of God has arrived. God's promises are not the only thing being fulfilled here. We hear a story that may not make much sense. In fact, for years and to this day, I'm tempted when I hear the account of the presentation, I have in my mind like going to the church to baptize a baby. You know, that's the equivalent in my mind. They go to the temple to present the child in this. But there's something very different happening here. And what's interesting is there's more than one thing, and unless we're rooted in the Mosaic law, we don't completely appreciate it. First of all, Mary is there to fulfill her purification offering. Under the prescriptions of the book of Leviticus, particularly chapter 12, a woman was inherently unclean for 7 days each month related to her period, but after giving birth, there was a further period of purification, and that purification after childbirth meant going and making an offering at the temple. So, after giving birth to a boy, there was an additional 33 days. After the 7 days of being unclean, the 33 days was a period of what was known as blood purity, which was the woman was not unclean, but she still could not touch anything sacred or step foot into the temple. And at the end of the 40 days of total, then the purification offering was made at the temple. A lamb and a pigeon or turtle dove was to be offered. Despite Mary's childbearing being different from other women, and that is connected to the mystery of the Immaculate Conception and the virginal birth, but despite her childbearing being different, she, in solidarity with all women under the law, arrives at the temple in this passage to make the prescripted offering. Joseph, meanwhile, is lurking in the background. We hear in the Gospel of Matthew that infancy narratives are dominated by Joseph. Joseph is kind of the center stage figure. The Gospel of Luke puts Mary at the center. But Joseph is present and reveals himself as a man of poverty. How do we know this? Because the prescription of the law, and what Luke quotes, is that a poor person that couldn't afford the lamb could just offer 2 pigeons or 2 turtle doves as a poor person's substitute. So Mary comes in fulfillment of the law to make offering. Joseph comes as a man of justice, but also revealing himself as a man of poverty. And then, of course, there's Jesus, whom this account is really about. Now, the firstborn child of a woman has to be redeemed. Why? Because if we go back to the era of the patriarchs in the Old Testament, priesthood was properly exercised by the father of the family. And when a firstborn child came about, the double portion of the inheritance that belonged to the firstborn was because the firstborn was meant to assume this priestly role as the head of the family from his father. This was how the righteousness towards God was fulfilled. But then, as is the case throughout the Old Testament, sin got in the way. The particular sin that got in the way here was the episode at the foot of Mount Sinai, when while Moses was on the mountain, the people of Israel worshiped the golden calf. And if we remember that accounting, even though everyone went depraved, it was the sons of Levi that stayed true. And so from this point on, the priesthood was passed to the Levites. But there was an additional prescription made to remember this, that this had happened because of the sins of the people of Israel. From that point forward, every firstborn child had to have a redemption offering made for them, and recognition that their priesthood was passed to another. And so, Jesus, as a firstborn son, must be presented and sacrifice made on his behalf, because the priesthood is passing away. But if we notice carefully, and unless we have all of this Old Testament history in the background, we wouldn't notice this. Nothing is said in the gospel account about sacrifice being made for Jesus. Is this because the Holy Family knew he was to be the great high priest? We don't know. But it's an interesting omission that we're told of Mary's proper sacrifice for purification, but we're not told of any sacrifice made for Jesus as a firstborn son. So, before we pick up further this theme of familial priesthood, which is important today, let's quickly look at the other readings. And there's a lot of options for today. We heard Sirach and Colossians, but there's options for Genesis and Hebrews as well, 2 Psalm options. And so first of all, the ones we didn't hear, Genesis and Hebrews. Those readings unpack a common theme. The story of a great promise being made to Abram that he would be father of a nation, of a great family. Now this involves, at the time of the story, the fact that Abram is an old man and is childless. His wife Sarah is barren. They are beyond the ability of conception. She is barren, and yet God tells Abram that he will be father of a great nation. How will this be? In the foreshadowing of Jesus, there is a miraculous conception and birth of a child. Isaac is born, and through this, God's promise is to be fulfilled. Abram, we're told, puts his faith in the Lord. When God tells him, even though he doesn't know how God is going to bring this about, and it is credited to Abram as righteousness. Now, in the letter to the Hebrews, it unpacks the next part in Genesis, the episode in which God asks Abram to sacrifice Isaac. And Abram, without questioning, goes, despite the fact that God seems to be contradicting himself. This is incomprehensible that God could ask this. After all, Isaac was the miraculous child, and Isaac was the means by which God was to fulfill his promise to Abram. But Abram, without asking question, follows what God tells him and prepares to offer Isaac his only son. Isaac, foreshadowing Jesus once again, carries the wood of his own sacrifice to the top of Mount Moriah, the site of the future Temple Mount. And Abram is prepared to offer his beloved son until God intervenes and sees the faithfulness of Abram. And God knows that Abram is not the one that ultimately will be called to offer his only begotten son. It's the Father himself that will do that on Calvary. So that is in one setting of background of faithfulness. The set of readings we heard Sirach and Colossians that speak a lot of, Sirach speaks of honor, speaks of natural virtues in the family, while Colossians speaks of humility and forgiveness, but also has that passage, one of two places in the New Testament that really make people squirm in the pews when they hear it. Colossians and Ephesians. Wives, be submissive to your husbands. Paul could not be admitted into Harvard today. Husbands, love your wives. And as Ephesians will add on, as Christ loves the church. Children, obey your parents. These instructions are seemingly practical, but it speaks to something more. Again, after the golden calf incident in the desert, there was a division of sorts in the priesthood. A distinct set of people are set aside as priests moving forward, just as is true in the church today through ordination. We have the sense in which all the faithful baptized assume a priesthood in Christ, and yet there is also a set-aside group of ordained priests with a sacred ministry. In the same way, just as I stand before you as a sacramental or ordained priest, fathers still to this day are called to be the priests of their families. In the church, just as ordained priests are spiritual fathers, fathers are called to be the priests of the domestic church. These two complement one another. They're not something other or separate, but complementary. This is why a priest to be ordained must be a father, not just called that as a title. If not, we can't succeed. If a priest is just merely a bachelor who does sacred rites, then he is not a father. St. Augustine once stunned a congregation while preaching. Actually, he did that quite frequently. He was St. Augustine. But on one particular occasion, he stunned his congregation by addressing the men present as his fellow bishops, calling to mind that they too were called to holiness and sacrificial service in their families. This speaks to a mystery beyond gender roles. This speaks to something of the human person. And so again, we hear those words of Colossians, children, obey your parents. A humility and obedience, a fidelity. Wives, be subordinate to your husbands. What does this mean, really? Support your husbands in their priesthood. Both in reverence, yes, but also expecting them to lead. Wives, it's okay to expect more out of your husbands. Men, priesthood is not about power. It's not about control. Every debate, whether it's the nature of priesthood, men and women in priesthood, or in conversation about gender roles or this very passage of subordination, gets controversial only because we equate it with power. Power is not what is in their conversation here. Priesthood is about love and sacrifice. Husbands, be the priests of your domestic church. Don't be passive. Don't make your wife drag you to church. Lead like a man. Take your family to church. As an aside, every year I warn people when we're preparing kids for First Communion and their first confession, one of the things that most stabs my heart, because children are adorable when they come to confession, they're so honest. And in fact, they're so honest that they inadvertently confess their parents' sins as well. But what stabs me through the heart is when a child cries and says, I'm guilty of sin that I missed Mass. And I warn parents, if I hear that, my first question will be, honey, do you have a driver's license? No? Then that's your mommy and daddy's sin. Fathers, be priests. lead your families. The Holy Family had the best excuse of all to not go to the temple and synagogue with regularity. After all, what's the excuse we hear? Why do I have to go to church to worship? I can talk to Jesus at home. Mary's not buying it. Yeah, Jesus was in the home, and yet the family, in fullness of fidelity, was at the temple on every holy day, was at the synagogue with regularity. And so all of these passages are about a proper priesthood of the faithful in humility, obedience, and worship. That is what is at play in the Feast of the Holy Family. The domestic church provides for a school of love, and Pope Paul VI gives a famous and wonderful reflection on the school of Nazareth when he visited the Holy Land, of what we can learn by entering the school of Nazareth, studying with the members of the Holy Family, how to cultivate a spirit of silence to allow the voice of God to be heard, how to be sanctified through our labors. And most of all, the family is the place where the love of God is meant to be revealed, shared, nurtured, and grown. Women lead a life of natural sacrifice through motherhood, both physical and spiritual motherhood. Women don't have to be told what it means to literally give of themselves. That is the beautiful feminine principle of the family and the church. Womanhood receives the promises of God and is the means through which life is given and nurtured, and therefore a world without the feminine principle is lifeless. The woman nurtures her family through instinct and giving of self, and in that woman is strength, gentle and nurturing and fierce in protecting. The masculine principle is to provide, protect, and lead, to offer proper priestly sacrifice, not through domineering power or chauvinism, but through priestly sacrifice, to put one's humble trust in God's promises, to act in all fidelity, as in the case of Abraham, all the way to Joseph. In 1 Kings chapter 2, we hear the speech of David to his son Solomon near the end of his life. And he says, "Be strong and be a man. Keep the mandate of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, commands, ordinances, and decrees as they are written in the law of Moses, that you may succeed in whatever you do." Not only is it important, I mentioned already, take your children to church, of course, but fathers, bless your children. With your wives, take charge of their religious instruction, for the parents are the prime catechists of children in the domestic church. And teach them to love through the holiness of your marriage. None of this is about gender roles, reductionism, or failing to recognize complicated family structures. But it is speaking of the best of what God has created and becoming the fullness of who we are created to be so that we may participate fully in the mystery of divine love. Today, in the octave of Christmas, we continue to revel in the mystery of the Word made flesh, the salvation of God, the consolation of God, drawn intimately near, born into our flesh and into a human family. Family life is hard. It was hard for the Holy Family. But if we are to live lives of communion, then it must begin at home in the domestic church. No matter how challenging or wounded our family structures may be. So on this feast of the Holy Family, may we enter into the school of Nazareth and learn from the Holy Family to love like Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and enter into the fullness of that communion.